Okay, so let's talk about our first unit of biology. And before I even do topic one, let's talk about biology, chemistry, and physics in general. Chemistry, I would say, is the type of course where it's about there's some like theory understanding, and there's very minimal calculations, right? Like when we did chemistry, we had to do a little bit of adding and subtracting and multiplying once in a while, but for the most part, it's very like applied. Physics, on the other hand, is highly math-based at first. Physics is almost all calculations, Gesundheit. This is going to really contrast with biology. There's no calculations in biology. You don't need a calculator, and really you don't need to like take the knowledge that I give you and somehow like use it to like solve problems, if that makes sense. There's no problem solving. Right? Let me give you an example. If I were to ask you in chemistry whether or not an equation is balanced, there's like an applicational skill you have in terms of balancing an equation. Or if I were to ask you how to properly combine multivalent compounds, there's kind of a skill you need to acquire. Does that make sense? Physics, or biology, there are no skills you need to acquire. There's no like task-based stuff we're doing. It literally is, I'm going to tell you stuff and you need to memorize it. And that's kind of it. Does that make sense at all? Like biology, I'm going to give you some words and you have to know what all the words mean. Which actually leads me to my opening slide here. And this may not make sense, but I'm going to give it a try anyways. I want to tell you a famous story. It's called Plato's Allegory of a Cave. And this is not what you're going to be tested on, but it's an analogy for what biology is like. So bear with me, but this is my analogy for like the skill I need you to have in biology. Here's Plato's like story. This is not real, by the way. This was his like pretend metaphor story. He proposed an idea where imagine that there were slaves, and these slaves, they were kept in mines underground. And so you can see in the picture right here that there's a person outside of the cave, but most of the people are inside the cave down there. And these slaves, not only have they lived their entire lives underground, but their children are slaves, and they've lived their lives underground. And their children's slaves have lived underground. Okay? And so you need to like imagine a hypothetical generation of people who they've never been outside in their lives. Okay, that was his like thought experiment in his story. Okay, and he wanted to suggest that these people, there was a fire behind them. So I need my laser pointer real quick. Bear with me. This is my laser pointer. Here it is. So you guys can see right here that here are some slaves. There's people right here. And these slaves right here, they've been chained up and they cannot go outside. There's a fire behind them. And the reason why the fire behind them is important is that it causes shadows to appear on the wall over here. Now, in Plato's idea here, these shadows represent ideas or concepts that these people right here, they can't directly see them. Because in order for them to see the shadows, it's like it's coming from behind them, if that makes sense. Right? Because how else do you get a shadow? The light causes this thing right here to create shadows. So they can kind of see images of stuff, but it's not really real stuff, if that makes sense. Because we all know that a shadow is just like it's not even a picture. It's almost just like a partial image of what's there. It's not real. Does that make sense? If you wanted to go see real objects, where would they have to go? Outside. That was kind of Plato's idea. But to these people, this is the only thing that they experience is they see the effects of things. Okay? That was his analogy. Does that make sense, the idea there? So these people, they know stuff, but what they know, is it real? Well, to them, yes, it's real because it's the only thing they've ever experienced in their lives, right? So if these people right here were to see a picture of a tree, for example, somehow a shadow of a tree were to end up on the wall there, they would recognize it as a tree, but is it actually what we know as a tree? No, because a real tree is outside. But to them, that's their reality. That's all they've ever known. And so based on what they know up till now in their lives, these people here, basically, they would have started naming things that they see on the shadows. They would have said, well, that's a tree, and that's a balloon, and that's a dog, and that's a cat, right? But, again, are these shadows real? No. Okay, here's the point as to why I wanted to tell you this crazy story, because you might be thinking, Chris, what the heck does this have to do with anything? Okay, I feel like this is a good metaphor for when we're talking about biology. Okay? Because in biology, there's the actual item itself. There is your heart. There are nerves. There are tissues. Okay, and those things are outside of the cave. Those are actually real, tangible items. But we have to begin by talking about concepts right here that you can't really see or touch or feel. And what we've really just done is just given a name to it, right? And that name is artificial. For example, why do we call it a heart? Is there any specific reason why we have to call it the word heart? Or could we have called it a kablugava, right? It's just a random syllable that we've assigned to it. And in that same way, these people right here, they don't really know what the actual thing is yet. They just know what they can perceive, and they assigned a word to it. Okay, and that's where we're going to start with biology. Okay, we basically, our whole unit is all about naming stuff. Now, that's not the actual world though. Okay, eventually, if you go on in biology, you get to go outside and you get to actually play with the human heart and test a brain and consider nerve endings. Does that make sense? But we're not to that spot yet. So you guys are that generation that is really at this point in your lives, all you're really doing is talking about hypotheticals. And yeah, does that make sense at all? Is what I'm describing here? So let me move to my next slide here. Here is one of those Wordle things that you can make online that I found that talks about biology. And these are all sorts of words and vocabulary you need to know. Things like cells or membranes or concentrations or plants or, these aren't even all of the ones we need. Okay. So let me give you guys some advice before we begin our unit. Okay. If you have a binder and loose leaf paper and you use something like that, here's a suggestion I might give for you. As we go through this unit, it might be worthwhile to make some sort of chart, and maybe it looks like this, maybe it looks like something else. But I've had my previous Science 10 classes do this, and usually by the time they're done, they have over 100 words that they've added to their word wall. Okay, and that's the advice I might give you, is that most of what we're doing this unit is me telling you vocabulary and saying this is what this thing is called. Memorize the word. Okay, and eventually, as you guys go further on in biology, you'll actually get to work with those things, like hearts and cells and tissue. But for the most part, it's mostly we're just discussing concepts similar to these people right here who they're not looking at the real object, they're looking at images on a screen of the right thing, but that's all you're able to perceive as of right now. Does that analogy make sense? That's why I like the Plato's analogy. So basically write down, I don't know whether you want to use this one here, but write down basically a long list of bolded words. And I'll do my best as we go through slides for everything that I've got bolded here to give you time to write it down on basically your word list. And if you miss it, then just write it down later. Okay, so let's begin. The first bolded word you should probably know is the word biology. What are we even talking about? And you probably have already guessed. Biology is the study of biotic things. You guys know that word biotic from previous years? Anything biotic is something that is alive, living, yeah. And so that's what the slide there says. Basically, biology is the study of anything that's living. Okay. And there are a lot of different subcategories of biology that you can get into. We're going to start really basic in grade 10, and if you like this, take grade 11 and grade 12 biology. So here's a couple of things that you might study. You might study fields based on the origin. Where did our species come from? Those would probably be evolutionists. Growth. How do things grow? How do they reproduce? What sort of structures do they have? We spend a lot of time talking about structures. Things like, what is a cardiovascular system? What is a heart? What is palisade tissue? What is xylem, right? And if you know some of these words, that's great. And if I said some words there and you're like, what word was that, Chris? Well, that's kind of the point of me teaching you, right? So, behavior, distribution, taxonomy. Do you guys know what taxonomy means? Humans are categorized as Homo sapiens. You ever heard that before? there's like a whole classification system that biologists have for how they name things. It goes, what's the order again? I believe it goes kingdom. I'm not going to write them all out. It's kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species. I think I missed one. You guys ever heard those before? And so if you ever hear Homo sapiens, that's like the genus and the species. Okay. A wolf is called a Canis lupus. Ever heard that before? Canis means that a wolf is part of the canine family, just like dogs are kind of like cousins of theirs. So, anyways, that's taxonomy. It's the idea of like, how do we like categorize things? So usually we start with, is it a plant? Is it an animal? Is it a protist? And you kind of work your way through categories. So that's what I've got right here, actually. It's defining groups based on characteristics. Okay, I've got a quick little video I want to show you. I just realized I didn't turn the sound on my thing here. So give me a sec. I got to plug in sound real quick. Let's make sure this is working. Sounds like it's working. So let's find the quick little video I want to show now. This sound works. Yep, there we go. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to start with this is that what's biology about? Well, biology is about living things. Okay? And you guys have learned a little bit about cells, hopefully before in grade 8. You do a little bit of stuff in grade 9 even, I think, on this stuff. So we need to kind of begin with some history. Most of our lessons actually, as we go into physics and chemistry, there's a little bit of a history component. So today my goal is basically to talk about a lot of the things that this video mentioned here and discuss what we think we know so far, at least, about cells and living items. So here I want to begin with two words on here. Maybe they should go together on your word wall. The word is either known as abiogenesis or it's known as spontaneous generation. Okay, and we're going to start our history lesson like a couple hundred years ago. Okay. Basically, the idea is that where does living stuff come from? And the idea is it just shows up, magic. Cells just come out of nowhere. That was the theory. Oh. And they kind of had a reason for deciding this. Okay, I want to present to you this concept right here. There's a bit of a picture right here. Okay, that's meant to be just a dish, and inside the dish is meat. Okay, and humans, for as long as we've been eating, have recognized that, like, let's say we cook some meat and we eat some, I don't know, steak. And let's say that there's leftovers, and we leave those leftovers for a day, and then a week, and then a month. What happens to like really gross, disgusting food if you leave it for a long time? It starts to rot. Yeah. And so their idea was, well, I guess that rotting, which we now know is like bacteria and stuff like that forming it. But at the time they figured, well, look, there literally is like living, growing rot and mold and bacteria and fungus, and they knew that was living too. They figured it just must randomly just show up. Does that make sense? And I mean, it doesn't actually make sense anymore because we now know about things like bacteria. But at the time, they figured, well, look, there's nothing there. And all of a sudden, the stuff's starting to rot. And so the word they used was abiogenesis, which, if you kind of know anything about like roots of words, okay, bio means life. And abio then means like the opposite of life. And then genesis is usually referred to like as a concept of like, where does it come from, right? And so the question is, where do things come from? And the idea is basically that life came from non-life sources, which we now know to be false, actually. Life comes from other living things, but they believe that it just randomly, just spontaneously, magically appeared. That was their theory. Okay. Now here's a scientist that the one video didn't show, but I need you to know. The name is Francesco Redi, and he was an Italian physicist, and he questioned the belief that like maggots and mold just spontaneously showed up in meat. So he set up an experiment, and I need you guys to know some vocabulary. Hopefully you've heard it before. The words are controlled, manipulating, and responding variables. We've done these before in labs. Okay? A control is what you keep the same. Manipulating is what you change, and hopefully you can see something responding. Here's basically his picture. He had one jar of meat that he left uncovered. And as you would expect, it began to rot. Maggots and all sorts of other things started to form in those jars of meat. Then in this one right here, he covered his jar in parchment. Now, granted, it probably started to rot if you leave it long enough, but it was nowhere near as fast as the first one. And then the last one right here, he actually covered it with like something that was sealing it. Right? And so this thing right here, what ended up happening is some air is still actually able to make it through because it wasn't like an airtight container, but like it was somewhat sealed. This one right here, he sealed it with like a wax of some kind. And so literally nothing could get in. And so the only flask to produce flies then was the one that was open to the air, this one right here. And so Redi basically suggested that like, well, maybe there's something in the air itself that was causing these flies and these maggots to form. He didn't know about bacteria yet, but that's basically what he proposed. Does that make sense? He proposed that there must be microscopic organisms out there that we cannot see, but that were barricaded in by this cloth and this cloth right here. that was preventing the flies from showing up. Okay. Now here's the problem though. Was there still some air inside of both of these containers right here? Yeah, so I bet you these things would have rotted and molded eventually, but this one here definitely occurred fastest. Okay, next scientist I want you to know, his name was Louis Pasteur, French guy. And we actually still use his name in, if you ever heard the phrase pasteurizing, like pasteurized milk, it's actually named after a process he came up with. So he hypothesized this term here, the idea of microorganisms, things that we cannot see. He figured there must be some, I mean, he didn't use the word germs or bacteria or bugs, but he figured there must be something in the air that was causing life to just show up, causing things to rot, and these flies and these maggots showing up in pieces of meat. So he utilized a similar experiment. I even wrote out the words here. Manipulating, controlling, and responding. Here he has a flask that is sealed and no bugs show up. And here he has a flask that's not sealed. And look, yeah, there's some bugs and some flies starting to show up, right? Only he didn't do his with meat. He actually did his with some broth. And so his experiment looks a little bit different than this one, but it's the same concept. I believe I've got a photo of this on the next slide. It looks something like this. He boiled some chicken broth. Okay, basically soup. So imagine you have some sort of soup. He boiled it. What do we know now about boiling? What would boiling do? It would kill off all the bacteria, right? Like that's what we often do to try to sterilize and clean things, right? So he boiled it. In theory, he didn't know this, but in theory, he's now killed all the microorganisms. So the broth is now free of microorganisms because we've boiled it, we've killed all the bacteria off. What he had then is what was known as an S-neck lid to it. See how this looks kind of like an S right here? And what ended up happening is it was really challenging for bacteria then from the air, right? I go, achoo, and I sneeze, and we now know that germs are now in the environment, right? It was really challenging for germs to make their way through this S-neck kind of this little thing right here. Does that make sense? Just due to its like its curviness. Okay. What ended up happening was when he took that off, all of a sudden, new microorganisms were growing in the soup, right? And new bacteria was happening. There's another picture I've got right here I want to show you. Same concept. He boiled the soup, and so now there's no bacteria. You know where he did discover, though, some growth? He discovered some growth right here at the bottom of this little S neck right here. And it actually kind of makes sense. Because, again, someone sneezes and there's germs in the air, and it's not exactly like they used a lot of soap back then, right? We're talking a time in history when, like, things were dirty and unclean, right? What ended up happening is, yeah, air and germs and bacteria from the air, they managed to make it into right here. But, like, gravity kind of caused them to all, like, accumulate right here. They weren't really able to make their way back up and into the soup itself. And so they discovered that there was actually bacteria growing in this little section right here. And this seemed to like disprove again the idea that like just magically stuff would grow. They started to realize that maybe there was microorganisms. That's the word they use. I'm going to close that door real quick here. The word microorganisms. Things that we can't see, but that are still alive. Okay? And so the opposite theory of abiogenesis was then presented, and it was by Rudolf Virchow. So add this one to your word list, biogenesis. And basically the theory is that where does growing living things come from? Well, it comes from other living things. And we probably kind of know this to be true nowadays, right? Like, for example, if I want to get a new dog, it doesn't just magically just sprout out of nowhere, right? A dog comes because it came from a litter of puppies, which means it came from its parents, right? Or if I want to make a new plant, well, I need to start with, say, a seed. But where did that seed come from? Well, it came from a previous plant, right? And so even to this day, we've never really been able to like just magically make life appear out of nothing. And it led to the concept of cells. They didn't know about cells yet, by the way. but we use this idea that cells come from cells. Okay? And it's going to show up in the very last slide when we talk about cell theory, but like life comes from other life. Okay? If you want to make something new, you have to break it off of something that is also alive. Okay? So that's the idea of biogenesis. Okay? So that actually really leads into what I want to get to next, is the idea of these scientists, like you saw in the video. They were trying to figure out, well, like where do living things come from? What exactly is alive? So once they hypothesized that maybe there are microorganisms out there, maybe there are small things that we can't see, the question was, well, how do we see them? Right? Okay, I believe that there are germs in the air. They didn't use the word germs yet, obviously, right? But they believe that there's microorganisms in the air. I want to see them. Well, someone comes up with this great idea of, hey, let's use a magnifying glass and let's zoom in closer and closer and closer, right? And they kind of made fun of that in the idea where, like, in the video, where every single scientist basically in the 1700s, 1600s, they were all playing around with microscopes because they all wanted to look at really small stuff, right? And the one guy, Van Leeuwenhoek, was actually looking at like gunk off of his own teeth, which is like disgusting. But when you think about it, actually that might have been the best thing for him to look at, because there's definitely going to be living microorganisms, bacteria, when you scrape it off of your teeth, especially when no one brushes their teeth back then. Does that make sense? So they started playing around with this. And so here's some other people I need you to know about. It's Hans and Zacharias Janssen. And they made what we believe to be the first microscope in 1595. Maybe it was somebody else. It's really hard to know for sure. And all these scientists fought with each other saying, I was first. And they were like, no, I was first. I was first. And that's why they're pretending they're fighting each other. So we think it was Zacharias Janssen who came up with the first microscope. And basically they worked with lenses, right? Just like you might find in your glasses, trying to zoom in on things. The next name I want you guys to know is Robert Hooke. And they showed a picture of him in that video as well. Robert Hooke, once he came up with his microscope, he looked at cork. What is cork really made of? Do you guys know what cork is? So like cork would be like what you would cap a bottle of wine with. That's probably the most common use of cork. Basically, it's wood, okay? And it's been saturated with water so that it can swell and kind of expand, which is how they can cork wine with it. And yeah, basically it's wood. Okay. Now, is this wood right here, is it alive currently? Was it at one point though? Because where did the wood come from? A tree. And a tree was alive. And things that are alive we now know were made of cells. So he was looking at pieces of cork and he saw a picture that looked like this. Here's this picture. And he noticed that there were all these little like circular kind of dots. They were either circular or maybe they were all rectangular when he zoomed in under his microscope. We're going to do this in a lab, by the way. I'm not going to give you a piece of cork, but usually I do this with a piece of onion. And if we slice a piece of onion up, we can actually see all of the cells within it. And it literally just looks like this. There's a rectangle here, and a rectangle here, and a rectangle here. And they might not all be uniform. Sometimes there's like longer ones and shorter ones. And sometimes we can actually, even within these cells, see like a big dot in the middle, which is actually the nucleus, which is kind of cool. They didn't know about nucleuses at the time, but we do now. Anyways, he saw all of these like rectangular and square patterns, and basically the legend goes he called them cells, and we literally still use this word 400 years later. And the reason why he called them cells is that they looked kind of like monastery cells where like monks or priests would live. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, basically think of like a big apartment building, and basically each room in the apartment building is basically a rectangle. And so he's like, yeah, here's the first one, here's the second one, here's the third one. That's what it kind of looked like to him, and so he was like, let's call it a cell. And we still call it that. So let me go back to where I started our lesson. Remember that whole idea of Plato's cave where you got all the people who didn't even know what they were talking about because they couldn't see the actual thing yet, and they saw shadows? That's what Robert Hooke really did, right? He saw the first cell in a way. He didn't know what it was. He had a really crude microscope, and he just needed to call it something. So he just randomly picked a name and said, it looks like this. I'm going to call it that. Right? If it had looked like an elephant to him, maybe we'd be calling cells elephants from now on. And we wouldn't think it's weird, because 400 years later, we'd have just gotten used to it. So, anyways, that's Robert Hooke. He called them cells. Okay. Here's another picture of cells. I like this one here. You can actually see some of the things inside of them. I don't believe this thing right here. This is probably something extra, but like this right here, those are nucleuses or nuclei that you're seeing inside these cells here. And Van Leeuwenhoek, he was actually the first one to see the movements of different types of single cells. Okay. He actually saw single cell things moving under his microscope, which we now know are things like bacteria and single-celled like germs and organisms like that. And he called them animalcules. Here's the reason why. He saw all this bacteria that he scraped off his teeth under the microscope. It was alive, because it's bacteria, right? And it was moving around. And because it was moving around like an animal, he called them animalcules. We don't use that word anymore, because it sounds kind of dumb, right? But I mean, is it any less dumb than Robert Hooke calling them cells? Because he thought it looked like a monastery? Anyways, single cells, we now know these are things like bacteria. But yeah, he called them animalcules. And then another guy I want you to know, Robert Brown, he wasn't in that video. He was the first to notice that within a cell, there's actually stuff you can see within the cell itself. So if this little rectangle kind of thing here is a cell, he recognized, hey, there's a little dot right here. Hey, this one's got one too. Hey, this one's got one too. And so does this one, and so does this one. And he kind of said, maybe there's things inside of a cell. And we know these things now. You probably learned about things like nucleuses and mitochondria, and eventually we're going to learn about things like ribosomes and endoplasmic reticulum, if you don't know those words. And so he was the first one to identify like the subcells. We have a name for those. We're going to learn it later, but I may as well tell you it now. We call them organelles. And organelles are like the things inside a cell, called organelles. They're like the things that are within that. Okay, two more scientists I need you guys to know about. Schleiden and Schwann, and they were the two that they showed in the YouTube video there. Basically, as these scientists started playing with microscopes, saying, hey, let's look at cool stuff under microscope slides. One of them said, I'm going to look at a whole bunch of plants. And to us, this seems like, duh, but like to them, they hadn't pieced this together yet. He basically said, I was looking at this plant, and that flower, and this leaf, and he discovered that, hey guys, everything that's a plant, I can find cells. And then another guy was looking at animals. And so he had some scrapings of his skin, and he had some scrapings probably from a pig and a chicken. And he was looking at their stuff under a microscope. And he was like, hey, this is made of cells too. And they put two and two together, and they say, hey guys, brilliant idea. I think that living things are made of cells, which like we now kind of take for granted. But before them, no one had really put that together. Right? And so basically they came up with the cell theory. They suggested that anything that is an organism is made of cells. So basically they suggested if you are alive or living, you're made of cells. Even if we can't see them, they hypothesized that they are there. And then you could actually do the opposite. They could say, well, what if it's not living? This plastic board I have right here, is it made of things that are living? Is it made of things that were once living? And so if your answer to that is, well, no, I don't think it is, then when they zoomed in on the microscope under that, they couldn't find cells. Right? And they were really able to categorize all things in the world as either biotic or abiotic. Maybe you guys know those words. Biotic means that it's made of living things, which means that if you use a microscope, you should be able to find cells inside of it. Or abiotic things, which aren't made of cells, right? So the wood in this desk right here, it was once alive, so you probably should be able to find some cells in it, right? But like the plastic right here, probably not. So last guy I need you to know about here is Rudolf Virchow. And he hypothesized that, well, where did life even come from in the first place? And he suggested that basically all these cells that we're coming from, They must come from other cells. Basically, that these cells are forming other cells. Okay. Now, you guys may not remember this from last year, but there's two terms you should have learned in Science 9. One is called mitosis, and one is called meiosis. Meiosis. There we go. I'm going to spell it right eventually. Do you guys recall those from Science 9 at all? Basically, it's what we now know exists as two different ways in which cells can replicate themselves. One of them actually forms sexual cells like sperm and egg, and then the other one is when your body literally reproduces. For example, this is what I tell my Science 9s whenever I teach this. Let's say that you go out, you play really rough like my 3-year-old does outside, and you skin your knee. Does your knee remain skinned for the rest of your life where it's raw and open and bloody? Well, no, right? Your knee will eventually heal, right? And why does it heal? Because your body is literally making new cells to replace the ones that are broken. Right? Even like your blood gets replaced every, I don't know what the stat is, but like you always are making brand new red blood cells. And like your blood actually replenishes itself over the course of like weeks or months, whatever the time is. So your cells make more cells. Not only that, but like sexual cells, sperm and egg, they can actually make brand new people and organisms, right? You are the product of mom and dad. So anyways, it was Rudolf Virchow that basically suggested, hey guys, I think that living things come from cells. Okay. And so that's basically the history I need you guys to know. You do need to know these names. So you should know some of these discoveries. On this slide right here are basically the ones I need you to have memorized. So if you want to add these to your word list, the contributions of Hooke, Van Leeuwenhoek, Brown, Schleiden and Schwann, and Virchow. So one more time, let's talk about what they discovered. Hooke discovered the cell. Van Leeuwenhoek discovered basically bacteria and called them animalcules because they were actually alive and moving under a microscope. Robert Hooke discovered things that were dead. Okay, like cork, which is basically wood, is no longer alive. But he discovered living things under a microscope for the first time. Robert Brown discovered the nucleus in a cell and discovered what we now call the subcells. Only the word we use for that is organelles. Schleiden and Schwann came up with the cell theory. Basically, one of them studied plants, one discovered animals, and they said, hey guys, everything that's alive must have cells in it. And then Virchow stated, and this is the Latin for it, it's omnis cellula e cellula. Basically, in English, rather than Latin, it basically means cells make cells, or cells come from cells, okay? Which basically goes back to where we started the lesson with the idea of spontaneous generation. They've now proven that life does not come just randomly, just shows up, but how does life occur? It has to come from pre-existing life. Which does beg the question, where did the first cell come from? And that's actually something that biologists still do not know as to how the first cell developed. They have ideas, though. So here's my last slide, then I'm done for the day. Here's the cell theory. I need you to know the 3 parts of it. Okay? And this basically is the building block on which we're now going to proceed when we talk about anything biological. Okay? Anything biological, which is living, is based on 3 fundamental, we don't even want to call them assumptions anymore. They were to like Schleiden and Schwann. They didn't know this for sure back then. They just proposed the idea. But we're pretty certain of this. So number 1, we believe that every organism that's alive is made of at least 1 cell, if not more. We as humans are made of trillions of cells. You've got skin cells and brain cells and heart cells and liver cells, right? And all of them do slightly different things. So we believe that if you're alive, you're made of cells. Part 1. Part 2, there is nothing alive smaller than a cell. That's as small as it can be with it being like a functioning living body. Okay? For example, is there things smaller than a cell? For sure, there's a nucleus. But the nucleus inside of a cell, if you just had the nucleus, it wouldn't be considered alive. It wouldn't live. You need the entire cell because you need the nucleus and the mitochondria and the cell membrane and the ribosomes. So even if there's pieces inside, remove those pieces and now it's no longer alive. Does that make sense? So cells are the smallest living thing you have. And then finally, how do you make cells? Well, they come from other cells, either through meiosis or mitosis, the process of either regenerating an exact copy, mitosis, or meiosis, where you make a half cell. We call them gametes, G-A-M-E-T-E-S. And when you put two of those together, sperm and egg, then you actually make like a new person, a new item. Okay, so that's the three parts of cell theory. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap my lesson here. Here's where we're going to go from here. Not tomorrow, because we have that assembly tomorrow, so I probably won't be lecturing tomorrow. But the next day on Wednesday, we're going to talk some more about microscopes. And then on Thursday, we're going to talk about all the parts of these cells. So hopefully you know already things like nucleus and mitochondria. But if you don't know what the heck a ribosome is or a lysosome, we're going to teach you. Okay. And then after that, then we can start branching off into the field that we're going to specifically study in grade 10, which is plant life. And so we're going to focus on, well, what are plants made of? How do they function? How do they grow? How do they reproduce? Okay. And then if you like this biology type stuff and you want to learn more about animals and humans specifically, that's what we do in grade 11 biology and grade 12 biology. Grade 12 has the sexual reproduction unit, where you get to talk literally about like how does new life form? How does, when a mommy and a daddy really love each other, and no, we're not going to do the sex talk. That's grade 12. But anyways, yeah, if you want to learn more about that stuff, that's where biology goes. So, all right. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay. I'm going to stop my video, then I'm going to give you some final instructions, and then you guys can take off if you want.